In March 1868, the trial of the president began, with Chief Justice Chase presiding and the Senate acting as jury. It was soon evident that the prosecution was out to get Johnson, regardless of the law, and that it thought that it had the necessary 2/3 vote for that purpose in sight. Johnson, however, was represented by an able panel of lawyers who pointed out, among other things, that such a contingency as the removal of Stanton, an appointee of Lincoln's, had been considered when the law was passed, and that many prominent members of Congress had at that time assumed that the Tenure of Office Act would not be applicable to such a case. Moreover, inasmuch as the president believed that act to be unconstitutional, he was taking the only possible course in dismissing Stanton to get it before the courts for final decision, a procedure on his part that could hardly be regarded as a, quote, high crime and misdemeanor, end of quote. Faced by these arguments and fully aware of the purely political nature of the attack on the president, 7 Republican senators voted with 12 Democrats for acquittal, and by the narrow margin of 1 vote, 35-19, the president was left in possession of his office. The 7 Republicans who voted for the president were soon made to feel the full weight of party discipline, for not one of them was permitted to remain in politics, but the correctness of their position was attested years later when the Tenure of Office Act, in spite of certain congressional modifications, was held unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. Stanton, after the failure of the impeachment proceedings, retired from office, and General J.M. Schofield took his place. On the struggle between Johnson and Congress, see, in addition to the Johnson biographies already cited, D.M. Dewitt, The Impeachment and Trial of Andrew Johnson, 1903, Frederick Bancroft, William H. Seward, 1900, Horace White, Lyman Trumbull, 1913, and The Diary of Golden Wells, 1911. The Diary of Gideon Wells, 1911. Meanwhile, the president, following as he felt he must the recommendations of General Grant, had placed an army officer in charge of each of the 5 Reconstruction districts of the South. The generals so chosen lacked nothing in authority, for the law set them above existing state governments and empowered them to make arrests, to conduct military trials, and to carry on as they saw fit the ordinary processes of civil government, specifically authorized by a, quote, 3rd Reconstruction Act, end of quote, passed in the summer of 1867 to remove such state officials of the Johnson regimes as were in any way obstructing their efforts. They made various uses of their prerogatives. General Sheridan, in charge of Louisiana and Texas, gave proof of his radicalism by removing from office the governors of both states, the Attorney General of Louisiana, the Mayor of New Orleans, and numerous other officials, all of whom he replaced with his own appointees. On the other hand, General Schofield, in charge of Virginia, made comparatively few removals and interfered as little as possible with the existing civil government of the state. Protests, both from the northern radicals who resented any appearance of softness on the part of the brigadiers and from the southern victims of their misrule, resulted in repeated and disconcerting changes in personnel. Sheridan, for example, was succeeded by General Winfield S. Hancock, whose honorable behavior led to his being superseded by General J.J. Reynolds, who in turn gave way to General R.C. Buchanan. The main business of these military overlords was, of course, to organize new state governments according to the plan laid down in the Reconstruction Acts. The first step in the process was to register the voters, a task that presented many difficulties. Army officers, freedmen's bureau agents, and loyal citizens generally, among them many Negroes, were made members of the registration boards. Eligible whites, although admonished by many of the best beloved Southern leaders to roll up the largest possible majorities for their race, were reluctant to register, but the Negroes presented themselves gladly. Immediately at the close of the war, many Southerners had had no very great fear of Negro suffrage, believing that the blacks could be persuaded to vote as their former masters directed. Indeed, one of the most telling of the arguments made against giving the freedmen the vote was based on precisely this premise. It was a well-known fact that the Negro population was concentrated in the best cotton-growing areas, where before the war the great planters had held sway. Sometimes in these black counties, the number of Negroes far exceeded the number of whites, although in the less favored white counties of the interior, the exact reverse was true. And so it could be maintained that, in case the few favored whites of the black counties were aided by Negro votes, they could control the various state governments in complete disregard of the far larger number of whites in the back country. Negro suffrage was thus feared, not so much for itself as for the danger it might involve of turning the South back to the rule of the old pre-war plantation aristocracy. The Northern radicals, however, had taken great pains to wean the Negroes away from their natural allegiance to their former masters, working mainly through the Union League, a private organization that during the war had existed to disseminate Northern propaganda, but that after the war had turned its attention to the Negro problem. They taught the freedmen that their former masters were not to be trusted, and that in all political matters they must rely strictly upon Republican advisors. To make the League the more appealing to the blacks, it was converted into a kind of lodge with an elaborate ritual and much ostentatious ceremony. Soon, with the aid of the Northern soldiers stationed in the South and the agents of the Freedmen's Bureau, the League organizers had most of the Negroes under their control, so that when the time came for registering them as voters, there was no question but that they would both register and vote as the radicals desired. Slowly and painfully, the Reconstruction process worked itself out. When the eligible voters were duly registered, it was found that in 5 of the 10 states, the number of Negro voters exceeded the number of whites, while in all the other states, with the possible exception of North Carolina, the white majorities were very slender indeed. Late in 1867 or early in 1868, these electors, or such of them as were permitted to vote, chose delegates to constitutional conventions, which with a minimum of delay began their deliberations. In every such convention, there was a large block of Negro delegates and a considerable sprinkling of Southern whites, mostly of the less favored classes, but the leaders turned out to be Northerners rather than Southerners, men who had come south with the Army or with the Freedmen's Bureau, or perhaps merely to fish in troubled waters. The number of Negroes in each of the Southern conventions was approximately as follows: South Carolina, 76 out of 124. Louisiana, 49 out of 98. Georgia, 37, Virginia, 25, Alabama, 18, Florida, 18, Mississippi, 17, North Carolina, 13, Texas, 9, Arkansas, 8. These carpetbaggers, as they were called, were thoroughgoing radicals almost to the last man, and they saw to it that such constitutions were adopted as the radicals in Congress would favor. Those Southern whites who were willing to follow the lead of the carpetbaggers were generally termed scalawags. The new constitutions, as a matter of fact, contained some admirable provisions. They looked forward to the establishment of far better public school systems than the South had ever known before, an end eagerly sought by the Negroes who regarded their lack of education as the most serious obstacle they confronted in their struggle for racial equality. These documents also copied the latest reforms and systems of taxation and finance, of local government, and of judicial organization that had found their way into northern state constitutions, but had not previously been current in the South. Such reforms, however, were small compensations to the dispossessed Southerners for the prospect of carpetbag rule that the suffrage provisions of every constitution seemed to make certain. Some of these provisions were even more drastic than those which Congress had prescribed, nor could the various attempts to ensure social as well as civil and political equality between the races be viewed with equanimity. When the newly drawn constitutions were submitted for adoption or rejection at the polls, the tendency was for the whites of every class, whatever their previous political connections, to unite in opposition. Sometimes these opponents of adoption called themselves conservatives. More and more frequently they came to be called Democrats, and to accept that designation. The Negroes, carpetbaggers, and some of the scalawags remained steadfastly Republican, supported the new documents, and in most cases were able to command majorities for them. In Mississippi, however, the proposed constitution was rejected at the polls, while in Alabama, ratification was defeated temporarily by a ruse. The law required that for a constitution to be adopted, the total vote cast in the election must constitute a majority of the whole number of registered voters. The whites, by systematically abstaining from voting, succeeded in keeping down the number of votes cast to a minority of the registered voters, and so in defeating the Constitution in spite of the fact that a large majority of those who voted were for it. But their rejoicing was short-lived, for the radicals in Congress promptly pushed through a fourth Reconstruction Act, which asserted that a majority of the votes actually cast, regardless of the size of the total vote, would be sufficient for ratification. Furthermore, to stop real or fancied discriminations against itinerant Negroes who tended to forget where they had registered and even the names they had adopted for the purpose, residence for 10 days preceding an election was declared sufficient to entitle such a person to vote, quote, upon presentation of his certificate of registration, his affidavit, or other satisfactory evidence, end of quote. Between June 1868, when Congress consented to the readmission of Arkansas under its new constitution, and July 1870, when Georgia, after much tribulation, was finally reinstated, each of the 10 southern states, including Mississippi, whose constitution after some amendment was accepted by the voters, completed the process of Reconstruction that Congress had prescribed. Of the many state histories of Reconstruction, the least biased and best is F.B. Simpkins and R.H. Woody, South Carolina during Reconstruction, 1932. Others of merit, most of them reflecting a more or less official, quote, Southern white man's point of view, end of quote, are J.W. Garner, Reconstruction in Mississippi, 1901, J.G.D.R. Hamilton, Reconstruction in North Carolina, 1914, W.W. Davis, The Civil War and Reconstruction in Florida, 1913, W.L. Fleming, Civil War and Reconstruction in Alabama, 1905. E.M. Coulter, Civil War and Readjustment in Kentucky, 1926. C. Mildred Thompson, Reconstruction in Georgia, Economic, Social, Political, 1866 to 1872, 1915. C.W. Ramsdell, Reconstruction in Texas, 1910. Ella Lawn, Reconstruction in Louisiana after 1868, 1918. All but 3 of these states were rushed through to admission in time to vote for Grant in the election of 1868. As a culminating act, each newly elected legislature ratified the 14th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States, which in July 1868 was declared in force. For those states that had not been readmitted before 1869, when the 15th or Negro Suffrage Amendment was submitted, that addition to the Constitution, in effect February 1870, had also to be approved. Senators and representatives from the readmitted states, most of whom were Republicans and many of whom were Negroes, were at length permitted to take their seats in Congress, and Reconstruction, technically speaking, was over. But the promise of withdrawal of Northern troops was not always fulfilled, for throughout the South, opposition to carpetbag rule mounted so rapidly that its continuance was everywhere recognized as wholly dependent upon military support. In carrying through this program of Reconstruction, Congress had consistently shown the finest disregard of constitutional niceties. It had not only ridden roughshod over the executive branch of the government, it had also defied the judiciary. In 1866, a decision of the Supreme Court, Ex parte Milligan, read by Justice David Davis, condemned as illegal the trial of civilians by military courts in regions where the civil courts were open for business. Although this case came up with reference to the action of a military tribunal in Indiana during the war, the decision seemed to cast serious doubt upon the legality of any such structure of military rule as that which Congress, notwithstanding, soon proceeded to establish in the South. Furthermore, if this decision held, numerous important verdicts of military commissions had been illegal, among them the one that had resulted in the execution of 4 persons, including the innocent Mrs. Surratt, for conspiring to bring about the death of Abraham Lincoln, and another that had cost Henry Wurz, a Confederate official at Andersonville Prison, his life. After the Milligan decision, radical denunciation of the Supreme Court After the Milligan decision, radical denunciation of the Supreme Court went to violent extremes, and leading Republicans in Congress took thought as to how they might most effectively destroy its power. In July 1866, they pushed through a law reducing the number of judges from 9 to 7. By providing that the next two vacancies among the associate justices should not be filled, they not only in effect reprimanded the court, but they also diminished the danger that President Johnson might appoint any liberals to sit upon it. 2 years later, another measure providing that a 2/3 majority of the justices should be required to set aside a law of Congress passed the House but was not brought to a vote in the Senate. Although Thaddeus Stevens favored legislation to deny the court any jurisdiction whatever over the enforcement of the Reconstruction Acts, Congress provided only that the court might not hear appeals from the lower courts in cases involving the right of habeas corpus. Reeling under these blows, the court took pains to avoid as completely as possible all decisions that might offend Congress, although in the case of Texas versus White, 1869, it went on record as favoring the Johnson theory that the southern states, in spite of their acts of secession, had never legally ceased to exist. The first elections in the reconstructed states resulted in the choice of a dubious array of officials. The highest places went mainly to Northerners who had not become residents of the South until after the war, and who had frequently seen it for the first time as members of the Union Army. Lesser offices were held almost exclusively by Negroes, scalawags, and carpetbaggers. One Negro became Lieutenant Governor of Louisiana, another Secretary of State in South Carolina. Negroes were numerous in every legislature, and in South Carolina they outnumbered the whites 88 to 67. Most of the office holders were men of little property. In Louisiana, only 10 members of the legislature were taxpayers. In South Carolina, the total taxes paid by the members of both houses were less than $700. In Georgia, they were less than $100. Most of the Negroes and many of the whites chosen to office, including even judicial positions, were utterly illiterate. The inevitable result of entrusting the powers of government to such persons was an orgy of corruption. James Pike, The Prostrate State, South Carolina under Negro Government, 1874, is a classic picture. Another excellent contemporary account is Charles Nordhoff, The Cotton States in the Spring and Summer of 1876. For later opinions, see W.F. Nolan, The Negro in American National Politics, 1931, Charles S. Johnson, The Negro in American Civilization, 1930, and A.A. Taylor, The Negro and the Reconstruction of Virginia, 1926. Private enterprises such as railroad and canal companies were expected to pay sizable bribes in order to secure charters and indeed in order to carry on their legitimate business. If any enterprise happened to be thoroughly dubious, however, the chances were good that public money or public credit would be generously voted toward its support. Contracts were let to favorites at ridiculously high figures, and the public servants responsible took a cut of the profits. Public printing in Louisiana during a 3-year period cost approximately $1.5 million a year, about $700,000 of which was paid in 2 of these years to a newspaper belonging to the governor of the state, H.C. Warmoth, whose private fortune incidentally rose to a tidy sum before he left office. Worthless real estate acquired for next to nothing was sold by connivance to states or municipalities for prodigious figures. A single session of the carpetbag legislature in Louisiana cost nearly $1 million, whereas before the war the cost of a session had never been more than 1/10 that amount. What happened to this money was explained by a governor who had good reason to know the facts. Quote, "It was squandered in paying extra mileage and per diem of the members for services never rendered, for an enormous corps of useless clerks and pages, for publishing the journals of each house in 15 obscure parish newspapers, some of which never existed, while some never did the work, in paying extra committees authorized to sit during the vacation and to travel throughout the state and into Texas, and in an elegant stationery bill which included ham, champagne, etc." End of quote. The rule of the carpetbaggers raised tax rates to figures never known before and piled up debts which most of the southern states felt obliged later on to repudiate. But it must not be forgotten that such political depravity was no monopoly of the South. In New York, for example, during the same period, the Tweed Ring reduced graft to a science that the carpetbaggers might well have envied. While the word racketeering, with all of its relevant connotations, was the product of a much later age. Of all those who participated in the work of radical reconstruction, the Negroes were the least to blame for its excesses. Only a few of them understood what was being done, and only a few of those who did were shrewd enough to line their pockets with plunder. For the most part, they were but helpless victims of the conscienceless rogues who controlled them. Strange as it may seem, there was a brighter side to the rule of the carpetbaggers. They and their allies represented, however crudely, the underprivileged classes in Southern society, and they inaugurated many policies that were designed to better the lot of the ordinary man. Free public schools for the children of both races were generously supported, although with little regard for available taxation resources. E.W. Knight, The Influence of Reconstruction on Education in the South, 1913. The tax burden itself, unreasonable as it became, was distributed with better regard for ability to pay than formerly. Poor relief had never been less neglected, and the rebuilding of roads, bridges, and public buildings that had been damaged or destroyed during the war was carried forward with little regard for expense. Most of all, the taste of democracy that the lowly of both races obtained was not soon forgotten. The rights of the Negroes were soon curtailed, but the incentive remained, at least with some of them, to win back by merit privileges that they had lost because they had been given them too soon. As for the poorer whites, from whose ranks many of the scalawags had been recruited, they were never again quite so inarticulate as they had been in the days before their kind had sat in the seats of power.